Dawn in the forests of Borneo. Deep in the mangroves, something stirs. It's a monkey, and one of the oddest looking in all the world. The local people call it Orang Belanda, which means Dutchman, because they say its face reminds them of a sunburnt European. Perhaps we don't find the comparison particularly flattering. At any rate, we call the animal, rather more prosaically, the proboscis monkey. Only the mature male monkeys develop this enormous nose. The females and the young have relatively small upturned ones, not nearly so spectacular, but nonetheless distinctive in their charming retroussé way. No one is quite sure why the male's nose grows so big. It doesn't seem to serve any obvious practical purpose, and indeed it sometimes seems almost to get in the way. The most likely explanation is that it helps a male to attract a mate, that the bigger his nose, the more attractive a female will find him. Attracting females is indeed one of the preoccupations of the male proboscis monkey. He's polygamous and may have as many as 9 females in his harem. There is only one big mature male in each family group. When the infant males are old enough to fend for themselves, he drives them away and they join other youngsters in bachelor groups until they're big enough and their noses are long enough to attract females of their own. The babies, when they're newly born, have black fur and vivid blue faces. After about 6 months, the fur turns reddish-brown, but their faces remain bluish until they are about a year old. The females weigh about 25 pounds and the males almost twice as much, and that makes them a little ungainly in the branches, but they have their own methods of getting from tree to tree. These swamps are not easy places in which to live. Conditions are continually changing. As the tide sweeps in and out twice a day, the water rises and falls several feet, and its character changes from brackish to salty and back again. And as the river water mixes with the seawater, the sediment carried down from the distant mountains settles out as a thick, glutinous mud. But it's a mud full of food for any that can tolerate these difficulties. Mangroves are among the few trees that can manage to survive here. There are several different species of them, but most have arching stilt roots that hold them steady on the soft, insubstantial mud. As the water swirls around their roots, so the mud settles out and new land is created. The mud contains all sorts of edible bits and pieces, fragments of rotting leaves, particles of dead animals, and fiddler crabs live by industriously picking them out. The male fiddler crab, like the male proboscis monkey, has one greatly enlarged organ with which to impress a female. Not a nose, but a claw. He uses it not only to wave at a female, but also as a weapon with which to fight his rivals. While the males battle it out, the females eat, and twice as fast as the males, since both their claws are suitably sized for gathering mud. Other creatures also come out onto the mud to feed and to fight. These are fish, mud skippers, and they can live quite happily out of water as long as they keep their skins wet. The males squabble with one another for the right to harvest one particular patch. They're so obsessed with their battles that even mosquitoes don't distract their attention. They feed on small invertebrates that wriggle about in the creamy surface of the mud. With eyes on the top of their heads, mud skippers can see what's going on out of water, even when they're in it. And out on the open flats, others, guarding their territories, warn off even distant rivals by leaping high in the air. When the tide is out, the proboscis monkeys also come down to the mud flats, not to look for food there, but in order to reach isolated clumps of mangroves. Mangrove leaves are the monkey's main food. The young leaves are more tender than the older ones, which get a bit leathery. They also taste better, for as the mangrove leaf matures, it accumulates poisonous toxins, the tree's way of defending itself against leaf eaters. So the monkeys are very choosy about which leaves they gather. But even leaves that are newly sprouted and tender are not very nutritious. The monkeys have to eat great quantities of them every day in order to sustain themselves. Nor are the leaves easily digested. The monkeys have to have double stomachs like a cow, in which the leaves are kept for a long time in order for the digestive juices and bacteria to work on them. And in consequence, the monkeys all have huge bellies. This, for example, is almost certainly not a pregnant female. And while the elders, bloated after their bulky banquets, take a rest, the youngsters play games. Here and there, among the mangroves, grow several species of palm tree, and palm fruit is one of the few other foods that the monkeys relish. Palms, too, have their defences, not poisons in the leaves, but barricades of thorns, which even the monkeys have difficulty in crossing. Success. but getting back is just as tricky. The monkeys take fruit when it's dry, green or unripe. It seems that their digestion, geared to deal with leaves, can't easily cope with fruit if it's sweet and juicy. That, however, is no problem to a red-crowned barbet. It is a specialized fruit eater and lives on almost nothing else. After a day spent scouring the swamps for mangroves with new crops of young leaves, the monkeys in the evening return to trees at the water's edge. There, few other creatures can reach them, and they're safe from enemies. Even so, they're not easy to find. You can travel for mile after mile through the uniform ranks of mangroves without seeing a single monkey. Then, suddenly, you will discover several family groups congregated in a relatively short stretch of riverbank. It seems that after a day of arduous travel and laborious grazing, the groups prefer to spend the evening and the night in one another's company. As the various groups settle down for the night, a gang of young, unattached males comes visiting, on the lookout, doubtless, for potential mates. The old males are outraged. The excitement spreads to the females. One group moves away to a different sleeping tree, and gradually peace is restored. These nightly tournaments undoubtedly give the females a chance to compare the relative merits of rival males, and sometimes one will move from one harem to another, so the males have to keep a sharp lookout. Now, as the evening draws on, the whole troop settles down for the night. While the monkeys slumber in the branches, down below, in the tangle of the mangrove roots, there is new activity. A mud crab is demolishing a mangrove seedling. On the leaves above, swarms of tiny beetles are feeding. Each species of tree has its own brand of toxic sap, and each has its own leaf eater that can deal with that particular poison. There are so many of them that they all can't tackle the leaf in what would seem to be the obvious way, to nibble at its edge. Instead, they doggedly dig little pits in its surface, perhaps avoiding the most poisonous parts of the leaf. This caterpillar is found on a different kind of mangrove. And this one has its own special measures to deal with the problem. It nibbles a tiny trench across the vein that supplies the bit of leaf it's going to eat, so cutting off the supply of poisonous sap. And with the debris, it builds little mounds which, with their toxic juice, help to keep away ants, the caterpillar's major enemy. If they do get past them, then the caterpillar has another form of defense. These particular ants nest in the mangrove branches. Lines of them, working together with marvellous coordination, pull leaves together and hold them in position. Then others arrive carrying their grubs in their jaws. The grubs produce strands of sticky silk, and the adults use them like living shuttles to weave a fabric that binds the leaves together. As the light of dawn spreads across the mangroves, the monkeys wake and prepare to set off once again on the daily round of food gathering. For other creatures, feeding has just come to an end. Huge fruit bats, over a yard across from wingtip to wingtip, are returning to their roost in the heart of the swamp. They, like the monkeys, prefer to spend their resting hours in company and will usually travel back even for many miles if necessary in order to do so. There is nothing for them to eat here, only the attraction of their own kind and the safety of a roost where virtually nothing disturbs them. The fruit trees where the bats feasted during the night are now being raided by others. A family of gibbons has come to collect any fruit that's left. The mangroves, too, are being plundered by other monkeys. These are silvered leaf monkeys, close relatives of the proboscis monkeys, though ones with a rather wider taste in food. They will eat the leaves and shoots of many different trees and creepers, but they still claim their share of the mangroves. And on the mud, yet another monkey has come visiting, a crab-eating macaque. And yes, it does eat crabs, together with almost anything else remotely edible that it comes across. And there are all kinds of morsels, animal and vegetable, to be gleaned from the mangrove mud at low tide. But this can only be a brief feast. The tide is returning. The fiddler crabs are so well adapted to life out of water that they have become air-breathing. So now, if they're not to drown, they must seal themselves in their burrows with a supply of air. The mudskippers, too, prefer to remain out of deep water if they can, for big hungry fish may come cruising in with the tide on the lookout for a meal. So the mudskippers retreat in front of the advancing waves. The tide waters flood far inland, creating creeks many feet deep, where only a few hours before there was bare mud. At low tide, the proboscis monkeys could have walked across here to reach the trees on the other side, but they're not deterred. They're excellent swimmers, able to swim beneath the surface for a surprisingly long time if necessary, and they move quietly with a minimum of splashing. There are crocodiles in these swamps that could easily make a meal of a monkey. At last, another mangrove tree with a fresh crop of young leaves. For a baby monkey, falling in the water is especially dangerous. But so long as it retains its blue face, any member of the group will come to its aid. Even an old male will tolerate his tail being used for support. Once the infants have lost their blue faces, however, they have to fend largely for themselves. Only their mothers will help them now. Mothers carry the small babies across major hazards. Their pink-faced offspring have to take their chances with the crocodiles. Crocodiles these days aren't the only danger the proboscis monkeys must face. Today, the greater threat comes from human beings. Mangroves are being cut down for the sake of their timber, and the swamps filled in to create new land for building. In parts of Borneo, where once there were thousands of proboscis monkeys, there are now only a few hundred left. If they are to survive at all, the mangrove swamps must be left unmolested. For in developing the skills and digestions to enable them to live in such difficult country, the proboscis monkeys have become so specialized that now they can live nowhere else.
And David Attenborough continues his natural history of Antarctica, Life in the Freezer, Thursday at 8 on BBC One.